This annual event is set aside to remember and to honor the 6 million Jewish victims of the Holocaust, as well as other targeted lies and messages before and during World War II. On Yom HaShoah, enlightened people the world over pause to contemplate the lowest moment in the history of humanity. The mayor of Toledo's proclamation recognizing Yom HaShoah will be read by Jack Lipszyc, child of Holocaust Survivors. Jack.
Good morning. This proclamation came from the office of the mayor of the city of Toledo. And it began, whereas the mayor of the city of Toledo is my privilege and responsibility to recognize causes and events that warrant our attention to people who have made significant contributions to our city and our society. And whereas from 1923 to 1945, 6 million Jews were murdered in the Nazi Holocaust as a part of a systematic program of genocide, and millions of other people perished as well as victims of Nazism. Whereas the people of the city of Toledo should always remember these atrocities so that such horrors are never repeated again. Whereas the people of our community should continue to dedicate themselves to the principle of equal justice for all people. And whereas the people of the city of Toledo should remain determined individuals against all tyranny and recognize all human provide the brief grounds for tyranny and flourish. And whereas the week of April 25th through May 1st, 2022, has been designated as a day of remembrance for victims of the Nazi Holocaust, known internationally as Yom HaShoah. And whereas it is appropriate for people of the city of Toledo to join in the commemoration, and therefore, I wait for the mayor of the city of Toledo to hereby proclaim April 24th through May 1st, 2022, the day of remembrance of the victims of the Holocaust. The city of Toledo and all residents to join in recognizing their many and hopeful needs, despite all the local prejudice and inhumanity, to education, vigilance, and resistance. In witness whereof, I here plunge to set my hand and cause the official seal of the city of Toledo to be affixed to the 24th day of April, 2022, wait education.
Thank you. We will now elect 6 memorial candidates who represent the while there have been and even continue to be unfathomably cruel genocidal actions in the world, the Holocaust is unique.
I apologize for the technical difficulties. While there have been and even continue to be unfathomable, cruel, genocidal actions in the world, the Holocaust is unique. Not just in its magnitude and methods, but also in certain particulars. That the Jews were not in conflict with those who murdered them. That mass murder of Jews took place across many borders, and the Jews that lived on both sides of the continent were murdered equally once the Nazis arrived. That except for a very few exceptions, bystanders in every country stood by idly while the Jews were taken away. That many non-Germans eagerly participated in the genocide as their countries were conquered by the Nazis, and that children were particular targets of the murderers. How could humanity have sunk to such a level? Even recognizing that anti-Semitism was deeply embedded in Western and Middle Eastern cultures. Sadly, anti-Semitism is again on the rise, here and abroad, both direct and under the guise of anti-Israelism. Let's remind ourselves today about what happens if anti-Semitism is left unchecked. The Holocaust was not perpetrated by a primitive people in a fit of passion in an unseen corner of the globe against enemies or strangers, but rather by Germany, the country that was the leader of intellectual, scientific, artistic, and philosophical thought at the time. And it took place in the heart of Europe, supposedly the most advanced part of the world, against its own most productive citizens and their co-religionists in other countries. Furthermore, anti-Semitism was not limited to the ignorant or uneducated, nor to the political right or left, as we are seeing again in the present. This makes Yom HaShoah even more important for us and for the society in which we live today. The Holocaust was deliberately and carefully conceived, organized, and led by men with doctorates and law degrees. Psychologists devised the tactics used to intimidate, humiliate, and dehumanize the victims. Logistics experts organized the cattle car transports of human beings to the concentration camps. Engineers and architects designed the gas chambers and crematoria, factories of death. Chemists created poison gas for the purpose of the mass murder of innocents. Physicians made the selection between those who would go directly to the gas chambers and crematoria and those who would be worked to death as slave laborers for German industrialists, as well as conducted inhuman so-called experiments on helpless victims. Politicians created the laws and regulations that rationalized first discrimination, then loss of political freedom and rights, then confiscation of property, next perpetration of atrocities, and then industrial-scale mass murders. Finally, murder was a piecemeal face-to-face enterprise for over 2 million of the 6 million killed in the Holocaust by wars that we learned about earlier this month from Father Patrick Desbois. While there were planners, it is even more important and frightening to realize that those who actually carried out those nefarious policies were regular people whose anti-Semitic bigotry, going back millennia, reinforced and magnified by Nazi propaganda and pseudo-science, turned them into monsters. There is a well-known quote from George Santayana, the philosopher and writer. Quote, "Those who cannot remember the past are condemned to repeat it." End quote. That is what we are facing today and going forward. I'm not talking about Holocaust deniers, crackpots and publicity hogs and Israel haters who ignore the Nazis' own extensive written and pictorial documentation, not to mention the Liberator's allies finding and the Nuremberg trials. I'm talking about reading a recent survey finding that almost 2/3 of the millennials and Gen Zers don't know that 6 million Jews were murdered in the Holocaust, and almost half can't name a single concentration camp. Another survey disclosed that more than half of the respondents had seen Nazi symbols in their community and online. Survivors and even liberators have been bearing witness to the Holocaust by their personal stories to counter such ignorance and warn of the consequences of anti-Semitism if left unchecked. Inevitably, most of them have either passed away or are no longer able to speak publicly. The story of the Holocaust needs to be passed on from generation to generation. Some second-generation children of Holocaust survivors have taken up the responsibility to make sure that the Holocaust will be remembered by this and future generations by speaking to youths recounting their parents' experiences, mostly to students. Incidentally, in some cities there is even an organized 3-gen group of grandchildren of Holocaust survivors who speak to groups. Today, we are fortunate to have Sam Zyndorf with us, child of Holocaust survivors, who will give us an example of how he has been educating area groups about the Holocaust for many years through the lens of his own family experiences.
First of all, I don't like moving bikes, so this may be better. The volume okay? In the back? Thank you. Many of you may have never met a Holocaust survivor. Both my parents were. Not only them, but almost all the relatives I had in my parents' generation were survivors. The small so-called friends were survivors. As a kid, whenever you went to a family function of our mitzvah, right, almost the entire adult population were survivors. I was surrounded by it my whole life. And you never spoke about it. So why am I here? As a kid, neither of my parents could speak of it. In fact, my mother never spoke of her experience. She wasn't psychologically capable of doing it. My father waited until we were probably in our 20s. We thought it was appropriate, so we would forget. All I can remember is when I was a kid, we would come home from school in junior high, high school, and today we learned about World War II or the Holocaust or Auschwitz. And said that was all bullshit. They can't tell you the real story. They'll never be able to tell you the real story. Back in 1985, my father, my brother, and I went back to his hometown in Toledo. Traced his steps from that hometown through the camps to his liberation. And that is worked well. I didn't mention I've been doing this for over 30 years. So I apologize to my wife for certain stories hundreds of times. So one more one. Because of the time restraint, I'm going to really focus on my father. But it wouldn't be fair not to mention my mother. My mother was born in 1919 in a small town called Regime outside of Lodge. Her father, Sina, my grandfather, who I named after, was married previously and had 3 sons. His first wife passed away. He remarried Reva, my grandmother. She gave him 3 daughters and another son. My mother gave him the middle daughter. My grandfather was a tailor in women's clothing. He did well, he wasn't wealthy, but as he was like to say, he was comfortable. Most of the older sons got married. My mother's older sister got married in 1938, had their first child in the summer of 39. Those who know, September 39, the whole world changed. My mother's older sister and her husband and baby took off. They ran away. Never to be caught. They got the entire war. The fields and woods, people's houses and farms, and survived. Everybody else except my mother and her younger sister were wiped out by mountains. Now I'm going to move on to my father. My father, I went to Pitcher Pole in 1924. Esther and Mendel, his parents, were expecting their first child, and he was born on New Year's Eve in 1924. The hope probably was for them, for their son to have a better life than they did. They were extremely poor, and after a couple of years, my grandfather, Mendel, took off, abandoned his wife and his child, fend for themselves. My grandmother used to transport and supply local bakeries with a wagon. That's how she lived. My father, at the age of 10, had to quit school to help his mother survive. It wasn't a good start to life. And in September 1939, their world changed dramatically. The Nazis invaded Poland, took it over in a matter of weeks. My father told me when we went back to Poland, even though he hated the Nazis, he hated Poles even more. They were worse than the Nazis. Polish people that were neighbors to Jews for generations turned in their neighbors for a pound of sugar, a pound of coffee. What people don't realize is the final solution was just a thought in 1939. There was no plan yet. So what did they do with all the Jews that they just rounded up in all these countries, all these towns and villages in Eastern Europe? They created the ghetto system. For those who don't know what the ghettos were, they would take the Jews in each town, consolidate them into a very small area, wall them in under horrific conditions. Minimal amounts of food, no medicine, no heat, while they came up with their ideas. They had several ideas before they came up with the camp system. They could shoot them, as I mentioned. They had mobile gas trucks. Just put them back in trucks, put a hose in, kill them wherever they could kill. That was my father's life for 2 years. In January 1942, just turning 17, he now had the solution plan. They brought us some trucks into his town, which was Big Poland, outside of Krakow. And they picked out 150 of their strongest males, put them on this truck. As they were leaving, they liquidated the town. They killed everybody else, including my grandmother. We drove out to the countryside to the location of 2 large Jewish cemeteries. The area is called Plusha, outside of Krakow. Most of you have never heard of Plusha. Not one of the famous things, not Auschwitz, not Dachau, not Treblinka. But I guarantee most of you know of Plusha. If you've seen the movie Schindler's List, that can't be Plusha. My father built it. But he didn't mention in the movie, until you see at the end, where Schindler is driving out of the camps in that big Mercedes, if you remember. They show him driving over papers of Jewish headstones. My father's first job was to remove the headstones and store them for papers. And then they built the streets of the camps. He was there for 2 years. He actually was lucky enough to run into a cousin, and they went through that camp together. If you remember the movie, the character played by Ralph Fiennes was the commandant. His name was Gap. Amen Gap. He was an Austrian. Much worse than the Nazis. Deep hatred for Jews. Hated them with a passion. He would actually sit in his home, which was on the perimeter of the camps, look out his window, and at his own whim, shoot them. He didn't like the way they looked, thought they were walking too slow. For whatever reason, no reason. He also used to go to the camps with 2 trained dogs. Big dogs, one on each side. And as he walked through the camp, if he saw a prisoner that he didn't care for, he would yell out, "Jew! Jew!" The dogs would attack the prisoner and tear to shreds while they were alive. He was physically a big man. He was about 6'4". My father had a pretty good job in that camp, actually. He took care of him and his cousins, took care of the horses. And the horses, the barns were next to the kitchens. There was a woman that felt sorry for the Jews. He used to sneak them food. So one night, my father, his cousin, were sitting in the hay, eating, and a shadow came over them. And he looked up, and who was it? It's Gap, standing over him with his dogs. This is it. We're done. The woman, for whatever reason, looking out the back door of the kitchen, saw this happening, and started screaming. Enough to distract Gap from giving the command. They ran out. Never with the command, they got away with it. Save their lives. In January 1944, my father's 90. The war is shifting. The Germans, for whatever reason, decide to move to another camp. In a capital, a more famous camp, Auschwitz. My father was there for a year. Auschwitz was actually a compound of 2 camps. People don't realize it. Birkenau and Auschwitz. One's a death camp, one's a work camp. My father's, being at that age, still was capable of work, so he was alive. And his job was to transport supplies, whatever, between the 2 camps. And in the summer of 44, probably after D-Day, but I don't know exactly. And the Germans know the end was going to happen. He was transporting between one camp and another. I always had a guard with him, German. The German jumped off the wagon, ran for the woods. He said, "I'm not getting stuck here. I'm gone." And my father's now with his horse and wagon in the middle of nowhere. Doesn't know what to do. Back to the gates. I don't know what happened. Let me back in. So he Goes back to the days, we let him back in, and he stays there until January of 1945. Now he's in Dhaka. By then the war is fairly over. The Germans have admitted. His fellow prisoners are dying left and right. Now we're into April of 1945. The Germans are on the run. So they put my father on a death march, him and 1,500 others. And we walked to Austria. And they get to the border of Austria. And the Austrian says, we don't want the Jews. The war is over. We're not going to be responsible for these people. You can't come in. I've actually been at this location where this happened, the monument. So the Germans said, what are we going to do with these people? We got to get out of here. So they decide to bring the trucks around with the machine guns. They line them up all on the riverbank. They're going to shoot them, all of them. They're going to float down the river. And for whatever reason, the wife of the commander of this death march says, what are you doing? It's over, let's just get out of here. I'm out of here. And he listens to me. And they pack up their guns, and they leave. And the Germans out of my father's section says, you're free now, you can go. So after 5 years of being in prison, he weighed 68 pounds, by the way, my height. So they just sat in the dirt. They just sat on the roadside, not knowing where to go. The very next day, which was 77 years ago this week, they hear all this equipment, machineries, vehicles coming over the tops of the hills. All green, all with white stars. It's the Americans. Pull up next to them, it's like the pictures you see, they're basically the living dead. The Americans felt so bad for these people, they gave them all their food. Gay ration, whatever they had, they gave them. Whoever ate died. The systems couldn't handle the intake they were given. By this time, my father had typhus. He was so sick he couldn't eat. He saved his life. So they gathered up prisoners, put them back in the trucks, took them back to camps. The Americans brought in medical staff, saved most of them, not all of them. My father met a gentleman in the camps that they became lifelong friends, who just died recently at 97. And after they got a little bit more healthy, they said they would, they wanted to work. So they got jobs in the kitchen. And my father was just amazed that the Americans had so much of everything. Poland had very little of anything, even before the war. My father loved fruit. He loved oranges. And they had cases and cases, just piles of oranges. He says, can I have an orange? My father used to eat oranges every day until he got sick. To help him get better. They gave him all the Germans' clothes. Prisoners had nothing, so they started wearing the Germans' citizens' clothes, which is 3, 4, 5 times as big as they were. He had something. He remembers the German citizens coming into the camps. Now the Germans wiped out. They had nothing. Begging for food. And the Jews that were working used to chase them out with sticks and stones, because my father hated the Germans because they all knew what was going on. They were going to help them. So they started rebuilding their lives. This is now the summer of 45. People ask me how my parents met. I don't know. I never asked that question. Why? It's too late now because out of all the relatives I have, there's only one left. One survivor. She was in Packard, New York. She died in the late 90s. We have one left. And she probably went up to that age. So they get there and hoping for a better life, obviously. Got married in March of 46. In November of 47, they wanted their first child, my sister. We were going to get her grandmother. And in October of 49, I probably had enough of Europe. He was sponsored to come to this country. He really had no relatives. Came to this country in October 49. We were supposed to go to Florida, which is where the final destination was, we were told. Because my father then found a relative, or actually the government found a relative, my father had an aunt that he wasn't aware of that was alive in Europe. My father's mother was one of 10. All white. Except this one man. He was dropped off in New York with his luggage. He stayed there 5 years. He learned to trade. He learned how to bake. My brother was born. He decided to relocate again. My father relocated a cousin that was also a camp survivor, also a baker. My father and his family moved to Cleveland to buy a bakery. That bakery failed. Life wasn't great, but it was better. We heard about a bakery for sale in Toledo, Ohio. We relocated here. They borrowed money from relatives. We came here. A few months later, they were lucky enough to have me. I was born here 65 years ago. But a tragedy followed. Because 3 years later, the firstborn, my sister, died at the age of 11. Life went on. We did the best that we could. I think back to Esther and Mendel, hoping that their son would have a better life. And I think he did. With all the tragedy that he had, he got to see his sons grow and prosper and marry. He got to hold their grandchildren. And they lived a pretty good life. So with all that they went through, they still got something better out of it. You know, it's difficult to think back. I've been doing this for over 30 years. Because of my time frame, I think I'm close to that. I usually tell a little bit of both sides. And I have some stories on my mother's side. I mentioned earlier, my mother was born in 1990. On all her documents, she was born in 1924. When the Germans captured the regime, my mother did two things that day. She took her glasses off, threw them away, and she took 5 years off of her life. She told them she was born in 1928. Because younger people had a better chance of living, and any defect would be a reason to kill her. Glasses were a defect. Even though she needed to wear glasses, she didn't wear them at all. She never took those 5 years back. Until the day she died, she never knew that I knew. But I found out through her sisters, and I found out the documents I found on Ancestry.com and stuff like that. Her sister survived and relocated to Toronto. That young child that my older aunt had, Paula, is an 82-year-old retired accountant in Toronto today, Morris. My younger aunt had 6 grandchildren. My older aunt had 5 grandchildren. So we do survive. And I'm here to tell their stories. because nobody else would. Baby?
Sam, how do family members find family?
Well, I don't know much about my father, because my father was an only child, he had no family.
Like your mom?
But my mother, what happened in Europe after the war, before the internet, how did these people find each other? And what they would do, a lot of them would go back to their villages and their towns that they started at. And what they established in these towns, between the town squares, they would put up big billboards, big boards. People would write, Zyndorf grew up in this town and now living in this town. And they would travel from town to town looking for survivors. And my mother, after the war, traveled with her younger sister, Lola. And they ran across some people and said, by the way, Mama's still alive, the older sister. In fact, she's in the next village with her husband and child. My mother told her sister, you stay here, I'm going to go check. See if she's there. And when she got there, it was in the middle of the night. She got to the address that she was told. She knocked on the door. It was a two-story building. And she knocked, and finally the woman came down. A person came down from the other side of the solid door. Said, who is it? Now my mother was traveling with two other women that were sisters. She says, Hindea and two sisters. And the woman on the other side of the door says, don't lie to me, my sisters are dead. And I only had two sisters. She misunderstood. She thought my mother said Hindea and her two sisters. And she wouldn't open the door. And my mother started crying. She recognized the cry. And she opened the door.
Sam, as a son of the Holocaust survivors, after the war, white folks ended up in DD camps. Did that also play a role in your family? That's my first question. My second question is, how were you able to get your folks to tell you these stories? White folks that want to help me.
My mother was psychologically dead. Never spoke. Never. Her stories I know from her sisters and all of her brothers. My father, again, when we were little kids and teenagers, nothing. Like I said, when we came home, he said, I learned about Auschwitz. They can't take the rest of it. When Schindler's List came out, Ellen and I went to the preview part of the movie that night. We're watching. I didn't know anything about Schindler. And as I was watching, I whispered in a couple of this is Auschwitz. This is my father's camp. So I go home. My father's not retired in Florida. I call him and say, well, Dad, there's a movie came on. Sure, this is the camp's Auschwitz. But you should see it. It's a tough movie. So you'd be better off not for it. And of course you would. And you call me the next day. There's nothing. They can't include everything. They can't tell you how it was. So for us who've seen the movie, the end was Disney. It was make-believe. And then, the only time I ever saw my father cry regarding the Holocaust, we went to his hometown. The building where he lived was gone. We went to Ploshop. We went to Auschwitz. He showed me his barracks where he lived in Auschwitz. We went to Dachau. While we're in Dachau, there's a museum in Dachau. And there was films that constantly on a roll. He started crying. He cried in Auschwitz. He cried in Poland. He cried at Dachau. Then we went to the riverbed where he was supposed to be done. We went to his apartment and he wanted us to know before he was gone. Any other questions? Because I'm going to ask myself too, if you don't ask me.
Yes, we have an uncle that was in Auschwitz. He was Shomer. And he talked about it was his wife that did survivors. And is that suitcase your father?
does it bother me or is it painful for me to talk about this? About my parents? First of all, it's a story that has to be told. And the biggest reason I do it is with all these deniers, disbelievers, that when they're gone, and when I'm gone, 10, 20, 40 years from now, when there's a conversation going on, and somebody says, that's all property, that never really happened. Okay, at least one kid says, I remember this guy came to our classroom, told me about his parents. So it must have really happened. If I've done that, I've done my job. Now, this is my problem. My wife said, you really came to this thing? This is my problem. She's never seen this. She's never seen this. She's never gone to a classroom. This is the first time she's actually seen me do this. My father and his wife came over in 1949. USS Black, General Black. He was sponsored. This will be my next thing. We were sponsored, we had no family members by the Jewish Federation. At that, Jews were destroyed in 4 places. The United States, Canada, South America, and after 1948, Israel. My father came to Miami, Florida. That's what it says here. When they came across, as I told you, they found a relative. So they pulled in the New York Times. It says, get off the ship, we're not responsible, have a good life, you're on your own. I said, no, I'm going to Florida. I said, no, you're on your own. We're not responsible. Have a good life here. I bring this for 3 reasons. For those who hopefully can't see it. This is a suitcase that has seen its better days. The first is loaded. I keep my papers that I found, my family liberation papers, photographs of relatives that are deceased, are all in that suitcase. That's reason number 1. Reason number 2 is, can you imagine coming here on a naval ship, having most of your world possessions in that suitcase? Starting a new life. I found his name and his address in Florida, where we're supposed to end up. And third, and most importantly, it represents the case that 6 million Jews could not carry. I found that in an ad years and years ago. It's in the better days. It's very important. My daughter's one of those. That was the case. Nothing else? I do have more stories, but